The twin sons of Zephyr Prime cast ethereal shadows across the crystal spires of Lamethia as Dante Rivers wiped grease from his hands with a worn cloth. 3 weeks stranded on this backwater world, and he was no closer to fixing his busted transport ship than when he'd crash-landed in the desert. The local mechanic spoke in riddles about sacred metals and blessed tools, making simple repairs unnecessarily complicated. But it wasn't the mechanical challenges that had caught his attention this morning. It was the screaming. Dante dropped his tools and jogged toward the city's eastern wall, where a crowd had gathered. Through the gaps between purple-skinned Zephyrians, he could see smoke rising from what looked like a merchant caravan. The locals were backing away, their silver markings glowing with fear-induced bioluminescence. "What's happening?" he asked a nearby fruit vendor, whose 4 arms were trembling as she packed her wares. "Lucy's," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant roars. "The Guardian has gone mad again. The priestess's rituals aren't working anymore." Dante pushed through the crowd until he reached the wall's edge. Below, in the crystalline valley that surrounded Lamethia, a magnificent creature was indeed tearing apart what remained of a trading convoy. The beast stood nearly 40 feet tall, its body resembling a massive wolf crossed with a dragon. But instead of scales or fur, its hide gleamed like living crystal, refracting the sunlight into rainbow patterns that should have been beautiful if not for the destruction it was causing. "Lucy's," Dante murmured, remembering the stories he'd heard in the taverns. The ancient guardian of Lamethia, older than the city itself, protector against the shadow beasts that emerged from the planet's dark side during eclipse season. "Stay back, human," a melodious voice commanded behind him. Dante turned to see a young Zephyrian woman pushing through the crowd. Her violet skin seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and intricate silver markings spiraled down her arms like living tattoos. She wore flowing robes of deep blue that marked her as temple-born, and her long silver hair was braided with small crystals that chimed softly as she moved. "I'm Priestess Nyx Silverwind," she said, though her luminous amber eyes never left the scene below. "And you need to get away from here before Lucy senses your alien presence. Guardians don't react well to off-worlders." Dante studied her profile, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her markings pulsed with what he was learning to recognize as anxiety. "When did it start getting worse?" "What?" Nyx finally looked at him, clearly surprised by the question. "The Guardian's aggression. When did your rituals stop working?" Her markings dimmed slightly, and Dante realized he'd hit a nerve. "That's not your concern, human. This is sacred business." "The name's Dante," he said with a slight smile. "And everything becomes my concern when I'm stuck somewhere for 3 weeks with nothing to do but observe." Before Nyx could respond, Lucy's let out another earth-shaking roar. The crystalline wolf dragon had finished with the caravan and was now turning its attention to the city walls. Its eyes, like molten amber, fixed on the gathered crowd. "Everyone back!" Nyx shouted, her voice carrying an authority that made the crowd obey instantly. "Form the protective circle. Singers, begin the calming harmony." A group of robed Zephyrians began a haunting melody that seemed to resonate through the crystal structures of the city. But instead of calming, Lucy seemed to become more agitated, its crystalline fur standing on end as it charged toward the wall. "It's not working," someone in the crowd cried. Dante watched as Nyx's face went pale, her silver markings flickering erratically. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the weight of a failing tradition on her young shoulders. Without thinking, he vaulted over the wall. "Are you insane?" Nyx screamed after him, but Dante was already jogging down the slope toward the approaching guardian. Lucy's was magnificent up close. Each crystal scale caught and refracted light like a prism, creating a dazzling display that should have been mesmerizing. Instead, the creature's fury was palpable, its massive paws shaking the ground with each step. "Easy there, big guy," Dante called out, his voice calm and steady despite the fact that he was walking toward what most people would consider certain death. "You're not really angry at them, are you?" The guardian slowed, its massive head tilting as if trying to understand the strange creature approaching it. Dante could feel the intelligence behind those amber eyes, ancient and profound. "You're in pain," Dante continued, now close enough to see the way Lucy's favored its left front paw. "Something's wrong, and all their singing and chanting isn't helping because they're not listening to what you actually need." He stopped about 10 feet away from the creature, well within killing range. Behind him, he could hear Nyx and the other priestesses chanting more urgently, but their rituals seemed to only make Lucy's more agitated. "Mind if I take a look?" Dante asked, extending his hand slowly. The guardian lowered its massive head, amber eyes studying this strange human who wasn't afraid, wasn't running, wasn't shouting ancient words that meant nothing. Instead, Dante simply stood there, radiating the same calm confidence that had gotten him out of tight spots across a dozen worlds. To the absolute shock of everyone watching from the wall, Lucy's lay down. The creature rolled slightly to one side, exposing its left paw. Embedded in the crystal flesh was a shard of dark metal, likely from some piece of machinery the Guardian had stepped on during its rampage. "There we go," Dante murmured, pulling a pair of pliers from his tool belt. "This is going to hurt for just a second, but then you'll feel much better." He worked quickly and efficiently, extracting the metal shard with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years fixing broken things. Lucy's winced but remained still, occasionally rumbling deep in its chest in what sounded almost like purring. When Dante stepped back, holding up the offending piece of metal, Lucy's rose to its feet and shook itself like a dog. The crystalline fur settled back into place, and the Guardian's aggressive posture melted away entirely. "There," Dante said, patting the creature's massive shoulder. "All better." Lucy's responded by nuzzling against Dante's chest with enough force to knock a lesser man over. The Guardian's crystal fur was surprisingly warm and smooth, and Dante found himself grinning as he scratched behind one of the creature's horn-like protrusions. The silence from the city wall was deafening. When Dante finally looked back up at the crowd, he saw faces frozen in shock, disbelief, and in Nyx's case, something that might have been awe. Her amber eyes were wide, her silver markings pulsing with rapid, excited patterns he couldn't interpret. "Well," he called up to them, his hand still resting on Lucy's neck, "anyone want to explain why your sacred rituals didn't include checking for splinters?" The Guardian chose that moment to lie down again, this time curling around Dante like a massive, crystalline cat. Its rumbling purr echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of contentment that none of the priestesses had ever heard before. Nyx stared down at the impossible scene before her. In all her years of training, through all the ancient texts and sacred ceremonies, nothing had prepared her for the sight of their ancient guardian being comforted by an off-world human with grease under his fingernails and an easy smile. As Dante settled against Lucy's warm crystal flank, apparently planning to enjoy the afternoon sun, Nyx realized that everything she thought she knew about guardians, about tradition, and about the sacred bond between protector and city, was about to change. And despite the chaos this would surely bring to her ordered world, she found herself surprisingly eager to see what would happen next. The Temple of Eternal Light had never felt more suffocating to Nyx as she knelt before the altar of sacred crystals, trying to focus on her morning meditations. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. Dante Rivers, the impossible human who had done in 5 minutes what generations of her family's bloodline had failed to accomplish in recent months. 3 days had passed since the incident at the wall, and the city hadn't stopped talking about it. Worse, Lucy's had taken up residence just outside the eastern gate, clearly waiting for his new human friend to return. The Guardian ignored all attempts by the priestesses to perform the traditional relocation ceremonies, responding only with what could generously be called bored tolerance. "You're distracted, child." The voice of High Priestess Kira Nightwhisper cut through Nyx's troubled thoughts like a blade through silk. Nyx opened her eyes to find her mentor standing behind her, silver robes rustling with disapproval. "Forgive me, High Priestess. I was merely thinking about the human." Kira's tone was not accusatory, merely stating fact. At 67 cycles old, she had seen enough of life to recognize infatuation when it presented itself. "This is precisely why I called you here today." Nyx rose from her kneeling position, her own blue robes settling around her like liquid starlight. I don't understand. Don't you? Kira moved to the great window that overlooked the city's eastern approach. From here, they could clearly see Lucy sprawled in the morning sun like some enormous, crystalline house pet. Our guardian has been corrupted by alien influence. The sacred bond between protector and city has been perverted by outsider interference. The word stung more than Nyx expected. Lucy's was suffering, High Priestess. The human helped him when our rituals failed. Our rituals, Kira said slowly, turning to face her protégé, have maintained the balance of this city for over 2,000 years. They do not simply fail, Nyx. They are disrupted by those who do not understand their sacred purpose. Nyx felt her markings begin to pulse with the telltale signs of agitation. But what if understanding the Guardian's actual needs is more important than following tradition blindly? The silence that followed was so complete that Nyx could hear her own heartbeat. She had never spoken to her mentor with such directness before, had never questioned the fundamental beliefs of their order so openly. You will go to the human, Kira said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You will convince him to leave Lemethea immediately. If he refuses, you will inform me, and we will take more direct action. High Priestess, This is not a request, Nyx. Kira's amber eyes glowed with inner fire. Your family has served as guardians of the Guardian for 30 generations. Will you be the one to break that sacred trust? Nyx felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. But beneath the familiar pressure of duty, something else stirred. A growing certainty that perhaps some trusts were worth breaking if it meant finding a better way. I understand, she said quietly. I will speak with him. An hour later, Nyx found herself walking through Lemethea's bustling marketplace, her temple robes drawing the usual respectful nods from vendors and shoppers alike. But today, she noticed something different in their expressions. Instead of the usual reverence, she saw curiosity, excitement, and in some cases, barely concealed amusement. Priestess Nyx, called out Jorik, an elderly crystal smith whose family had served the temple for generations. Have you come to see your human friend? He's not Nyx began, then stopped herself. Arguing would only fuel more gossip. Have you seen him today? Oh yes, Jorik grinned, his weathered face creasing with mirth. He's been here since dawn, trading stories with the merchants. Fascinating fellow, that one. Did you know he's been to 17 different worlds? Nyx's step faltered slightly. 17 worlds. She had never been beyond Zephyr Prime's twin moons, had never imagined what other civilizations might look like, how they might live and love and dream under alien stars. She found Dante exactly where Jorik had indicated, sitting cross-legged on a merchant's rug while a small crowd gathered around him. He was in the middle of what appeared to be a highly animated story involving his hands making swooping motions through the air. So there I was, hanging upside down from the landing gear of a cargo hauler, and the only thing between me and a 1,000-foot drop was a rusty bolt and my questionable life choices, he was saying, earning chuckles from his audience. Nyx paused at the edge of the crowd, struck by how easily he fit in despite being so obviously different. His dark hair and tan skin stood out dramatically among the violet and silver Zephyrians, but his easy smile and genuine interest in their responses transcended species barriers. But how did you escape? Asked Mira, a young fruit vendor whose silver markings were pulsing with excitement. Well, Dante said, his dark eyes twinkling with mischief, that's where things get interesting. You see, I'd made friends with the ship's cargo. He trailed off as his gaze found Nyx on the periphery of the crowd. Their eyes met across the small space, and she felt that same jolt of electricity she'd experienced when she first saw him calm Lucy's. His smile softened, becoming something more private, more intimate. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, rising to his feet with fluid grace, I believe I'm needed elsewhere. The crowd dispersed with good-natured grumbling about unfinished stories, but not before several people pressed small gifts into Dante's hands. A carved crystal pendant from Jorik, a pouch of sweet fruit from Mira, a small tool from another vendor who'd heard about his mechanical skills. Popular with the locals, Nix observed as he approached her, trying to keep her tone neutral. "They're good people," Dante replied simply. "Friendly, curious, willing to share their stories if you're willing to listen." He paused, studying her face with those perceptive dark eyes. "Something tells me you're not here for casual conversation, though." Nix glanced around at the lingering shoppers, several of whom were clearly eavesdropping. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private." "Lead the way, priestess." They walked in silence through the winding streets of Lamethia, past crystal fountains that sang in harmonious frequencies and gardens where bioluminescent flowers bloomed in the perpetual twilight between the city's towering spires. Eventually, they reached the Harmony Gardens, a secluded space where young priestesses often came to meditate. "This should be private enough," Nix said, settling onto a bench carved from a single piece of rose quartz. Dante remained standing, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. "So what's troubling you? And don't say nothing, because your markings have been flickering like a broken comm unit since you found me in the market." Despite herself, Nix felt a smile tug at her lips. "You're very observant for an off-worlder. Occupational hazard. You learn to read people quickly when you're always the outsider." His expression grew more serious. "Talk to me, Nix. What's wrong?" The use of her name, spoken in his warm, gravelly voice, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "The High Priestess wants you to leave Lamethia." "I figured as much." Dante settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could smell the pleasant combination of leather and something uniquely him. "And what do you want?" The question caught her off guard. In her 25 years of life, no one had ever asked what she wanted. Her path had been chosen before birth, her duties and obligations laid out according to traditions older than memory. She began, then stopped. "It doesn't matter what I want." "Of course it matters." Dante turned to face her fully, his dark eyes intense. "You're not just a priestess, Nix. You're a person, with your own thoughts and feelings and desires. What do you want?" "I want to understand," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I want to know why our ancient rituals are failing, why Lucy's responds to you when he barely tolerates us anymore. I want to know about those 17 worlds you've seen, what it's like to choose your own path instead of following one carved out by your ancestors." She stopped abruptly, horrified by her own honesty. But instead of judgment or mockery, she saw understanding in Dante's expression. "Those are dangerous wants for someone in your position," he said gently. "I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But I can't seem to stop having them." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "What if I told you that wanting to understand, wanting to grow and change and question, isn't dangerous at all? What if it's the most natural thing in the universe? Then I would say you don't understand our culture." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But I understand you." The simple statement hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Nix felt her breath catch as she looked into his eyes and saw something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "The High Priestess will expect an answer," she said weakly. "Then tell her I'll consider her request," Dante replied. "But first, I want to show you something." "What?" His smile was pure mischief. "How to really communicate with your guardian." Before Nix could protest, he was on his feet, extending his hand to her. She stared at it for a long moment, knowing that taking it would be another step away from everything she'd been taught, everything expected of her. But when she thought of Lucy's lying contentedly in the sun, of the genuine affection in the guardian's amber eyes when he looked at Dante, she realized that perhaps some traditions were worth challenging. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and strength of his calloused fingers as they closed around hers. The contact sent sparks racing up her arm, and from the way Dante's eyes darkened, she suspected he felt it too. "This is madness," she murmured, but she didn't pull away. "The best kind," he agreed, helping her to her feet. "Come on, priestess. Time to meet your guardian properly." As they walked hand in hand toward the eastern gate, Nyx felt something fundamental shifting inside her. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path, and despite the fear and uncertainty, she had never felt more alive. The Guardian's Heart. Part 3, The Bond Deepens. High Priestess Kira Nightwhisper stood at the temple's highest spire, her silver robes whipping in the mountain winds as she watched the scene unfolding below through her farsight crystal. What she saw made her ancient heart race with a mixture of fear and fascination. The human, Dante, sat cross-legged beside Lucy's near the eastern gate, his hands moving in slow, deliberate patterns over the Guardian's crystalline hide. But it wasn't his presence that troubled her most. It was Nyx, her most promising student, kneeling beside him with an expression of wonder that Kira hadn't seen in decades of temple service. "This cannot continue," she murmured to herself, then called out to her attendant. "Summon the circle of elders. Tell them we convene at sunset." 3 hours later, as the twin suns began their descent toward the crystal peaks, Kira made her way down the winding path toward the eastern gate. She had spent the afternoon in deep meditation, consulting the ancient texts, and preparing for what she knew would be either vindication or catastrophe. She found them exactly where her crystal had shown them, but seeing the scene with her own eyes was far more impactful than any distant viewing. Lucy's lay on his side like a massive cat, his crystal fur catching the late afternoon light in spectacular displays of refracted color. Dante sat with his back against the Guardian's flank, apparently showing Nyx something in a small, leather-bound journal. "And that's how we discovered that the crystal singers of Altair 7 were actually trying to warn us about the solar flares," Dante was saying, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. Nyx laughed, a sound so pure and genuine that Kira felt a pang of something she hadn't experienced in years. When had her serious, dutiful student become this radiant creature whose markings pulsed with joy instead of anxiety? "High Priestess," Nyx said, noticing her approach. The laughter died on her lips, replaced by the familiar mask of proper deference. "I didn't expect you here." "Clearly," Kira replied, though her tone was more thoughtful than reproachful. "Master Rivers, I believe we need to discuss your methods." Dante rose smoothly to his feet, his hand automatically going to Lucy's neck in a gesture that seemed both protective and affectionate. "I figured this conversation was coming. What would you like to know?" Kira studied him carefully. She had expected arrogance, the typical off-worlder assumption of superiority. Instead, she found genuine respect in his dark eyes, and a willingness to engage that surprised her. "I would like to understand how you accomplished in minutes what our sacred rituals have failed to achieve in months," she said carefully. "I listened," Dante replied simply. "Your rituals are beautiful, complex, steeped in tradition and meaning. But they're focused on maintaining a relationship that no longer exists. Lucy's has changed, evolved, grown beyond the parameters of your ancient agreements. Sacred bonds do not simply evolve," Kira said, though she was listening intently. "Don't they?" Dante gestured toward the Guardian, who was watching their conversation with intelligent amber eyes. "When was the last time you actually asked Lucy's what he needed instead of telling him what you thought he should want?" The question hit Kira like a physical blow. In 40 years of service as a priestess, she had never once considered that the Guardian might have desires beyond the sacred compact established by their ancestors. That is not how the relationship works," she said weakly. "Maybe it should be," Nyx said quietly, then immediately looked shocked at her own boldness. Kira turned to her student, seeing the conflict written clearly in her expressive features. The young priestess was caught between loyalty to her training and the evidence of her own eyes. "You believe the human is correct?" Kira asked. Nyx glanced at Dante, then back at her mentor. "I believe that Lucy's has never been happier than he is right now. And I believe that happiness matters more than rigid adherence to ceremonies that no longer serve their purpose." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at the feet of tradition itself. Kira felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders, but also something else. A flicker of the curiosity that had driven her to become a priestess in the first place, before duty and doctrine had smothered it beneath layers of proper behavior. "Very well," she said finally. "If you claim to understand our guardian better than we do, then prove it." Dante raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" "The trial of ascension," Kira replied, noting how Nyx's markings suddenly flared with alarm. "If you can complete the sacred flight with Lucy's, reaching the skyward peaks and returning safely, then perhaps your methods have merit." "Kira, no," Nyx said urgently. "The skyward peaks are sacred ground. No male has ever." "No Zephyrian male," Kira corrected. "The ancient laws say nothing about aliens." Dante looked between the two women, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "What exactly does this trial involve?" "You would ride Lucy's to the highest peak of our mountain range," Kira explained. "The flight itself is treacherous, with wind shears that have claimed the lives of experienced riders. But if you succeed, you would prove that your bond with our guardian is genuine." "And if I fail?" Kira's expression was grave. "Then your interference in our sacred traditions ends permanently." Dante considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Sounds fair. When do we start?" "Now," Kira said. "The winds are optimal at sunset." "Wait," Nyx stepped forward, her hand catching Dante's arm. "I'm going with you." Both Dante and Kira stared at her in shock. "Absolutely not," Kira said firmly. "The trial of ascension is a solitary journey. It always has been." "Then change the tradition," Nyx replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If we're questioning old ways, let's question all of them. Why should he face this alone when Lucy's clearly bonds with both of us?" Dante looked down at her, and Kira saw something pass between them that made her breath catch. It was the look of two souls recognizing each other, of connection that transcended species and culture. "She's right," Dante said quietly. "Lucy's responds to both of us. If this is really about proving the bond, then we should do it together." Kira felt the familiar ground of certainty shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about sacred traditions, about the proper order of things, was being challenged by the simple logic of what worked versus what was written in ancient texts. "This is highly irregular," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "So was a human calming our guardian," Nyx pointed out. "But it worked." Kira looked at Lucy's, who had been following the conversation with obvious intelligence. The guardian's amber eyes met hers, and for the first time in decades, she attempted to actually communicate with him rather than simply recite ritual phrases. "What do you want, old friend?" she asked softly. Lucy's rose to his feet with fluid grace, moved to where Dante and Nyx stood side by side, and gently nuzzled them both. Then he looked back at Kira and made that strange rumbling sound that was so clearly contentment. "I see," Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Very well. The trial will be modified. You will both attempt the flight to the skyward peaks." Dante grinned. "Now this sounds like fun." Nyx felt her heart racing as she watched Dante settle onto Lucy's back just behind the guardian's neck. The familiar position of a rider, but everything about this situation was unprecedented. No priestess had ever attempted the trial of ascension. No male had ever been permitted to touch the sacred peaks. And certainly no human and Zephyrian had ever made the journey together. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as Dante extended his hand to help her up. "Nyx," he said, his voice serious despite the smile on his lips, "I've never been sure about anything the way I'm sure about this." The way he looked at her, the absolute certainty in his voice, made her breath catch. She placed her hand in his and allowed him to pull her up behind him on Lucy's back. The moment she settled against Dante's solid warmth, her arms wrapping around his waist for stability, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. This wasn't just about proving a point to Kira or testing the bond with their guardian. This was about choosing her own path, about embracing the terrifying freedom of making her own decisions. "Ready?" Dante asked, his voice slightly rougher than usual. Nyx tightened her arms around him, feeling his heart beating against her chest. Ready. Lucy's launched into the air with a powerful thrust that pressed Nyx back against Dante's solid frame. The sensation of flight was intoxicating, but even more overwhelming was the awareness of every point where their bodies touched. His back against her chest, her arms around his waist, her thighs bracketing his hips as they moved with Lucy's as powerful wing beats. They soared above Lomethea, the crystal city spreading out below them like a map of stars. The twin suns painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the wind carried the scent of mountain flowers and something that was uniquely Dante. "This is incredible," Nyx breathed, though she wasn't sure if she meant the view or the sensation of being held so securely in his arms. "It gets better," Dante replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They climbed higher, past the cloud layer, into the thin air where the skyward peaks pierced the sky like crystal daggers. The wind here was treacherous, full of sudden gusts and downdrafts that would have challenged even the most experienced riders. But Lucy's moved through the air currents with an ease that spoke of perfect trust in his passengers. When a particularly violent gust threatened to throw them off course, Dante's grip on the Guardian's neck ridges never wavered, and his free arm tightened protectively around Nyx. "Trust him," Dante called over the wind. "He knows what he's doing." Nyx pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in his scent and feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life. This was what had been missing from all their sacred rituals, she realized. This feeling of partnership, of working together rather than simply following prescribed forms. They reached the highest peak just as the twin suns touched the horizon. Lucy's landed gracefully on the crystal platform that crowned the mountain, his breathing barely labored despite the challenging flight. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, absorbing the incredible view. All of Zephyr Prime spread out below them, the crystal cities glittering like jewels in the fading light. "We did it," Nyx whispered, hardly believing it herself. "We did," Dante agreed, but when she looked at his face, she saw something that had nothing to do with triumph over the trial. He was looking at her with an expression so intense it made her heart race. "Nyx," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." Before she could respond, Lucy's rumbled softly and began to groom his crystal fur, clearly content to rest on the peak for a while. The Guardian's casual behavior was so different from the rigid formality of traditional ceremonies that Nyx found herself laughing. "He's showing off," she said, watching as Lucy stretched and settled himself like a cat. "Smart Guardian," Dante said. "Knows how to set the mood." The teasing comment made Nyx blush, her markings glowing softly in the twilight. But instead of the embarrassment she might have expected, she felt a warm anticipation spreading through her chest. "What did you want to tell me?" she asked quietly. Dante turned on Lucy's back so that he was facing her, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "That I've traveled to 17 worlds, met thousands of people, seen wonders that would take a lifetime to describe. But I've never met anyone who made me want to stop wandering until now." Nyx felt her breath catch. "Dante. I know this is complicated," he continued, his thumbs tracing the silver markings on her cheeks. "I know there are traditions and expectations and a dozen reasons why this is impossible. But I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I think what you feel for me is real too." She stared into his dark eyes, seeing her own feelings reflected there. The fear, the hope, the desperate desire for something more than the prescribed life she had always known. "It is real," she whispered. "But Kira was right about one thing. I have duties, obligations. My family has served the temple for 30 generations. And what do you want?" Dante asked, the same question that had started this whole journey. "Forget duty and obligation for a moment. What does Nyx Silverwind want?" Looking into his eyes, surrounded by the incredible beauty of the world spread out below them, Nyx finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been fighting. "I want you," she said simply. "I want this. Whatever this is, wherever it leads." Dante's smile was radiant. "Then let's find out together." When his lips met hers, it was like the first time she had ever truly been kissed. Gentle at first, then deeper as she responded with a passion that surprised them both. The crystal peak, the setting suns, even Lucy's seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the two of them and the perfect rightness of being in each other's arms. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, Nyx rested her forehead against his. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Dante said, his voice rough with emotion, "we go back and face whatever comes next. Together." Far below them, High Priestess Kira watched through her farsight crystal as the two figures embraced on the sacred peak. She had expected to feel outrage, betrayal, a dozen different emotions appropriate to witnessing the violation of sacred traditions. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Perhaps, she thought as she put away the crystal, it was time for some traditions to evolve after all.